The docking clamps locked into place with a deep metallic groan, and the lights inside the Starling drift flickered once before settling. Danny Cole stood near the airlock with his hands in his pockets, watching through the narrow viewport as Threshold Station stretched out in every direction like a city floating in the dark. It was the largest orbital hub he had ever seen. Towers of gray metal rose from a central ring, covered in lights that blinked in patterns he did not understand. Ships of every shape and size were attached to its arms like insects resting on the branches of a massive tree. Nate Greer came up behind him and let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of Dracon flags," he said quietly. Danny nodded. The red and black banners of the Dracon Dominion hung from nearly every surface. This was their territory. Humanity was just a guest here, a minor species that had only recently earned a seat at the table of the Galactic Accord, and not a very comfortable seat at that. "Just keep your head down and get through the trade talks," Penny Walsh said from behind them. She was reviewing something on her datapad, her brow creased with the kind of focus she usually saved for surgery. "We sign the contract, we load our cargo, we leave. Simple." It was not simple. Within the first hour of boarding the station, Danny learned something no one had mentioned during the mission briefing. Every visiting officer above a certain rank was to be assigned a domestic worker for the duration of their stay. It was described in the welcome documentation as a cultural courtesy, a gesture of Dracon hospitality. The workers were Velhari, a species Danny had only read about in passing. They had been conquered by the Dominion decades ago, and their people had been scattered across the Empire as laborers, servants, and worse. Danny sat in the small quarters he had been given on the station and read the notice again. A worker had already been assigned to him. She would arrive within the hour. He didn't know what to do with that information. He wasn't the kind of man who gave orders to people. Back home, he had grown up in a small town where everyone helped their neighbors carry groceries, and nobody locked their doors. He had joined the fleet because he liked ships and open space, not because he wanted authority over anyone. The door chimed. He opened it and found her standing in the corridor. She was tall, taller than him, with pale blue skin and dark eyes that looked like they held 1,000 things she would never say. Her hair was white and pulled back tightly. She wore a plain gray uniform with no markings, no name, nothing to make her look like a person instead of a piece of equipment. She carried a small satchel over one shoulder. It looked nearly empty. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Then she knelt. "I am your assigned domestic unit for the duration of your stay," she said. Her voice was flat, practiced, like she had spoken these exact words 100 times before. "I am trained in cleaning, meal preparation, personal attendance, and environmental maintenance. I will fulfill any task you require. I ask only that you report any failures in my service to the station overseer so that I may be corrected." Danny stared at her. His stomach turned. "You can stand up," he said. She flinched. It was small, just a quick tightening around her eyes, but he noticed it. She stood slowly, keeping her gaze on the floor. "What's your name?" he asked. For a moment, something moved behind her expression, something that looked almost like confusion. "My designation is V4419, she said. "No," Danny said gently. "Your name, the one your family gave you." She was quiet for a long time. Then very softly, she said, "Say Lara." "Say Lara," he repeated. "That's a nice name. I'm Danny." She did not respond. She stood perfectly still, as if waiting for the real instructions, the ones that always came after the soft words. He could see it in the way she held her hands, fingers curled slightly inward, ready to protect herself. Danny let out a slow breath. He looked around the small quarters. There were 2 bunks, a table, a basic kitchen unit, and a narrow washroom. It wasn't much, but it was clean. "That bunk is yours," he said, pointing to the one on the right. "You can put your things there. We'll eat together at the table. You don't clean up after me, you don't serve me, and you don't kneel. All right?" Sara looked at the bunk. Then she looked at him. Her dark eyes searched his face for something. Some sign of a trap or a trick. She didn't find one, but she didn't trust what she saw either. She gave a small nod and moved to the bunk without a word. That evening, Danny made a simple meal from the rations he had brought from the ship. He set 2 plates on the table and sat down. Sara stood by the wall. "You can sit," he said. She sat across from him, stiff and upright, like a soldier waiting for inspection. She looked at the plate of food as though it might disappear if she reached for it. "Go ahead," Danny said. "It's just rice and vegetables. Nothing special." She picked up the fork slowly. Her hands were trembling. She took a small bite, then another, and something in her posture changed. Not a lot, just the slightest drop in her shoulders, a tiny release of the tension she carried like armor. Danny didn't push her to talk. He figured she had spent enough of her life being told what to do. The least he could give her was the space to just be still. Later that night, after the lights were dimmed, Danny lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He could hear Sara breathing on the other side of the room. It was slow and steady, but she was not asleep. He could tell. "Good night, Sara," he said quietly. There was a pause. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Good night." It was the first word she had spoken to him that wasn't part of a script. The next morning, Nate and Penny came by his quarters. Danny told them everything. Nate rubbed the back of his neck and looked uncomfortable. Penny's face went red. "They just hand people out like welcome gifts?" Penny said, her voice tight with anger. "And the Accord allows this?" "The Accord looks the other way," Danny said. "The Dracon are too powerful. Nobody wants to start a fight." "So what are you going to do?" Nate asked. Danny looked over at the second bunk, where the fin blanket had been folded neatly into a perfect square. Sara had left earlier for a required check-in with the station overseers. She had bowed to him on her way out. He had told her she didn't need to do that. She had done it anyway. "I'm going to treat her like a person," Danny said, "because that's what she is." Penny crossed her arms. "Danny, I'm with you, but be careful. The Dracon are watching everything. Humans are still new to the Accord. If you cause a scene, it could cost us more than just this trade deal." Danny nodded. He understood the stakes. He just couldn't bring himself to care about them more than he cared about the woman who had knelt on his floor and called herself a number. That evening, Sara returned. She stood at the door and waited for permission to enter. Danny waved her in and pointed to the table, where 2 plates were already set. She sat down. Her hands were still again, steady this time. She picked up the fork without being told. They ate together, and Danny noticed something small but important. 3 days passed on Threshold Station, and Danny Cole settled into a routine he had not expected. He woke up early, made coffee from the small supply he had carried across half the galaxy, and set 2 cups on the table. Sara was always awake before him, sitting on the edge of her bunk in silence, waiting. He never asked her to do anything. She never asked him for anything. But slowly, carefully, the distance between them grew a little smaller. On the 3rd morning, Danny asked her about the Valhari. He didn't push. He just mentioned that he had read a little about her people in the Accord's cultural database, and that most of the entries were short and dry, like someone had written them in a hurry and never gone back to check. He told her he was curious, if she felt like talking about it. Sara held her cup of coffee with both hands. She looked down at the dark surface of the liquid for a long time. Then she spoke. "We were astronomers," she said quietly, "before the Dominion came. My people studied the stars. We had names for every constellation visible from our home world. We wrote poems about the distance between them. Danny leaned forward slightly, listening. He said nothing. We had 2 moons, she continued. One was silver and one was pale gold. When they rose together, the whole sky looked like it was glowing from the inside. Children used to stay up late just to watch them pass each other. That sounds beautiful, Danny said. I have not seen them since I was 7 years old, she said. Danny felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't say he was sorry. He had a feeling she had heard that word too many times from people who didn't mean it. Instead, he asked her to tell him the name of one of the constellations. She told him one. He couldn't pronounce it properly, and she almost smiled. It was the closest thing to warmth he had seen from her, and it disappeared as quickly as it came, like a candle flame in a draft. Over the next 2 days, Sara began to share more. She spoke carefully, choosing her words the way a person walks through a room full of broken glass, but she spoke. She told Danny that the Velhari had built great libraries filled with centuries of poetry, philosophy, and astronomical records. When the Dracon conquered their world, the libraries were burned, not because the books were dangerous, but because the Dracon believed that a people without a history were easier to control. Danny listened to every word. He never interrupted. He never compared her pain to anything he had experienced because he knew it wouldn't be fair. He just sat across from her and gave her the one thing she had not been given in a very long time, his attention. On the 5th day, Danny noticed something he should have noticed sooner. Sara moved her left wrist carefully, never bending it fully, always holding it at an angle when she picked things up. He watched her reach for her cup one morning and saw her wince. A tiny movement she covered quickly. "What happened to your wrist?" he asked. She pulled her arm back against her body. "It is nothing," she said. Sara. She looked at him. There was no demand in his voice, just concern, and she didn't know what to do with it. "It was broken," she said after a pause. 2 years ago, at a previous posting. It healed on its own." "It didn't heal right," Danny said. He stood up. "Come with me." He took her to the Starling Drift, where Penny Walsh kept the medical bay, cleaner than most hospitals on Earth. Penny looked at Sara's wrist, ran a scan, and went very quiet for a moment. "The bone fused at an angle," Penny said softly. "It must have been painful for a long time. I can realign it with a micro-correction. It won't hurt. 10 minutes, and you'll have full movement again." Sara sat on the medical table, stiff and uncertain. Penny worked gently, talking to her the whole time, explaining each step in a calm, steady voice. When the correction was done, Penny placed a small pain relief patch on her wrist and held her hand for just a moment. "There," Penny said. "All better." Sara looked at her wrist. She bent it slowly, turning it one way, then the other. There was no pain. Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face away, ashamed of them. "You don't need to hide that," Penny said gently. Sara cried silently, her shoulders shaking without a sound. It was not the wrist. Danny and Penny both knew that. It was everything. It was years of being broken and never being fixed, years of pain that no one had cared enough to notice. Danny stepped out of the room to give her space. He stood in the corridor with his arms folded and his jaw tight. Nate found him there a few minutes later. "How is she?" Nate asked. "She's been hurt for 2 years," Danny said. "A broken wrist that nobody bothered to treat. 2 years." Nate didn't say anything. He just leaned against the wall beside his friend and let the silence carry the weight. That afternoon, Danny and Sara walked back to the station together. As they passed through one of the main corridors, a tall Dracon male stepped into their path. He wore the dark red armor of a senior official, and the insignia on his chest marked him as someone of high rank. His name was Cor Drayton, and his yellow eyes moved from Danny to Sara, with a look that made Danny's skin crawl. "You are the human officer," Kor said. His voice was deep and smooth, like a blade wrapped in silk. I have been told that you are treating your assigned domestic unit in a manner that is not consistent with station protocol. I'm treating her like a person, Danny said evenly. Kor tilted his head, the way a predator tilts its head when it finds something mildly interesting. The Velhari are not persons. They are resources, valued, maintained, and allocated according to their function. Your behavior confuses the other workers. It disrupts the order of this station. I'm not trying to disrupt anything, Danny said. I just don't make people kneel. Kor's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a stiffness that Danny recognized as anger being held just beneath the surface. You are a guest in Dominion territory, human. I suggest you remember that your species holds no weight in this part of the galaxy. Adjust your behavior, or it will be adjusted for you. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. That evening, Chris Langley, the human diplomatic liaison, appeared at Danny's quarters. Chris was a careful man, polite and measured, the kind of person who always thought 3 steps ahead and worried about all of them. Danny, I respect what you're doing, Chris said, standing just inside the doorway. But the Dracon are not happy. This trade deal is worth more than either of us can count. If they cancel it because one officer decided to play hero, Earth's provisional seat on the Accord Council could be at risk. I'm not playing hero, Danny said. I'm just being decent. Chris sighed. I know, but decency has a price out here. Just think about it, all right? Danny thought about it. He thought about it while he made dinner. He thought about it while he set 2 plates on the table. He thought about it while Sara sat down across from him, and for the first time, looked at him without fear in her eyes. Danny, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. Not sir, not officer, just Danny. Yeah, he said. Why are humans different? He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He didn't have a grand answer. He wasn't a philosopher or a politician. He was a logistics officer from a small town who liked ships and open skies. I don't know if we are, he said honestly. I just know that where I grew up, if someone was hurting, you helped. You didn't ask what they were worth first. Sara looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and went back to eating. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of 2 people sitting together who had decided, quietly and without ceremony, to trust each other. It happened on the 7th day. Danny had gone to the station's trade office to review cargo manifests, and Sara had stayed behind in the quarters. She had begun to read from a small archive that Danny had downloaded for her, a collection of old Velhari astronomical texts that the Accord's Cultural Preservation Wing had managed to save. It was incomplete and poorly organized, but it was the first time in years that she had seen her people's words written down in their own language. She was sitting on her bunk, reading quietly, when the door opened without a chime. A Dracon male walked in. He was broad and armored and dark gray, with pale yellow eyes and a scar along one side of his jaw. His name was Reth, and he served as a labor compliance overseer on the station. It was his job to inspect the domestic workers assigned to visiting officers, to ensure they were performing their duties and remaining in proper condition. She lowered her gaze and folded her hands in front of her, the way she had been trained. Reth looked around the room. He noticed the second bunk, the blanket folded neatly, the small archive device resting on the pillow. He noticed the 2 cups on the table. His lip curled. Kneel, he said. Sara knelt. Reth pulled a scanner from his belt and stepped forward. Compliance inspection, he said flatly. Arms out. The inspection was not medical. It was not kind. It involved scanning for tracking implant integrity. But it also involved physical handling, forced posture checks, and verbal compliance tests, designed to remind the worker of their place. It was, by every human standard, a form of humiliation, dressed up in the language of procedure. Sara held still. She had endured this many times before. Her face showed nothing. That was when Danny walked in. He had come back early because the trade office had closed for a Dracon ceremonial hour. He stepped through the door and saw Sara on her knees, with Reth standing over her, one hand gripping her arm, the scanner pressed against her shoulder. Danny didn't raise his voice. He didn't charge forward. He simply stepped between them, one hand gently moving Sara's arm free from Reth's grip, and stood with his back to her, facing the Dracon. "Get out," Danny said. Reth stared at him. For a moment, the overseer seemed more confused than angry. No human had ever stepped between a compliance officer and a Velhari worker. No minor species had. It was so far outside his experience that he didn't immediately know how to react. "This is a routine compliance inspection," Reth said slowly, as though explaining something to a child. "You are interfering with Dominion protocol." "I don't care what you call it," Danny said. His voice was steady and low, but there was iron in it. "You don't touch her. Not in my quarters, not anywhere." Reth's confusion turned into something colder. He straightened to his full height, a full head taller than Danny, and looked down at him with undisguised contempt. "You will regret this, human. I will report this to Command Dracon personally. You and your ship will be removed from this station." "Then report it," Danny said. "The door is right behind you." Reth left. The door closed after him, and the room went silent. Danny turned around. Sara was still on her knees, her head bowed, her hands pressed flat against the floor. She was shaking. He crouched down in front of her. "Hey," he said softly. "He's gone. You're okay." She didn't look up. "You should not have done that," she whispered. "They will punish you." "They will punish me." "Nobody's getting punished," Danny said. He didn't know if that was true, but he said it anyway, because she needed to hear it. He helped her stand and brought her a cup of water. She sat on the edge of the bunk, holding the cup, staring at the wall. Her breathing was slow and controlled, the kind of breathing that comes from years of teaching yourself not to react. Within 2 hours, the summons arrived. Dracon had called a formal hearing before the station's internal tribunal. Danny was charged with violating station labor protocols, interfering with an authorized compliance inspection, and, in the official language of the charge, corrupting Dominion property. That last word hit the crew of the Starling Drift like a slap. Nate read the charge document 3 times, and then set it down very carefully on the table, as though he was afraid of what he might do if he held it any longer. "Property," he said. "They called her property." Penny was already preparing. She pulled up the medical scan she had taken of Sara's wrist, and began compiling a full report. The scan had shown more than just the broken wrist. There were old fractures along her ribs, scar tissue on her shoulders, and signs of repeated malnutrition over many years. The evidence of long-term abuse was clear and detailed. "If they want a hearing," Penny said, "then they're going to hear everything." Chris Langley arrived at Danny's quarters just before the hearing. He looked tired and worried. "Danny, I've been on the comm with the Accord Liaison Office for the last hour. They're not going to back you. Officially, the Dominion's labor practices fall within their sovereign rights under the Accord Charter." "I know," Danny said. "If you apologize at the hearing and allow the inspection to be completed, we can still save the trade deal. The Dracon will accept a public show of compliance." "That's all they want, a gesture." Danny buttoned his jacket. The last time someone asked Sara for a gesture, she had to kneel on the floor while a stranger grabbed her arm. Chris closed his eyes briefly. "I understand how you feel, but there are bigger things at stake here." "There's nothing bigger than this," Danny said quietly. Not to me. The hearing took place in a cold, circular chamber deep inside the station's administrative core. The tribunal consisted of 3 Dracon officials, seated on an elevated platform. Core Dracon stood to one side, arms folded, watching. Reth was there too, standing stiffly with his hands behind his back. Danny stood alone in the center of the room. Sara was not present. She had been taken to a holding area before the hearing began. The lead tribunal officer read the charges aloud. Interference with authorized inspection, violation of station labor code, corruption of assigned property. Each word echoed off the metal walls. Danny was given the chance to speak. He stood straight, his hands at his sides, and looked at the 3 Dracons seated above him. He did not shout. He did not make a grand speech. He spoke plainly, in the simple, clear English of a man who had never learned how to hide what he meant behind complicated words. He told them that Sara was not property. He told them that she had a name, a history, a language, and a memory of 2 moons rising over a world that had been taken from her. He told them that the medical report prepared by his ship's doctor showed years of injuries that no one had treated, years of suffering that no one had questioned. Then he asked them one question. If the Velhari are truly lesser beings, he said, then why does the Dominion need chains to keep them still? Not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the hard, brittle silence of people who have just heard something they cannot easily answer. The tribunal ruled against him. The charges were upheld. Sara was to be reassigned immediately to a different officer under standard Dracon supervision. Danny was confined to his quarters pending the expulsion of the Starling Drift from Threshold Station. As Danny was escorted out of the chamber, he passed a side corridor. Through a narrow window, he saw Sara being led in the opposite direction by 2 Dracon guards. She was walking with her head down and her hands at her sides. But as she passed, she turned her head and looked at him through the glass. There was no despair in her eyes. There was something else, something that Danny had not expected to see. It was small and fragile and barely there, like the first green shoot breaking through frozen ground. It was hope. Danny held her gaze until the corridor turned and she was gone. Then he took a breath, set his jaw, and walked back to his quarters. He was not done. Danny sat in his quarters with the door locked from the outside. The Dracon had disabled his personal communication access and restricted his movement to the single room. He was, in every way that mattered, a prisoner who had not been officially called one. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the table where 2 plates had been set every evening for the past week. There was only 1 plate now. He hadn't touched it. On the other side of the station, something was happening that neither Danny nor the Dracon had expected. The hearing had been recorded. Every formal tribunal on Threshold Station was logged in the Dominion's internal archive for legal reference. The recordings were not meant to be shared. They were dry, procedural, and of no interest to anyone outside the bureaucracy. But someone, a low-ranking Dracon clerk, whose name would never be known, had copied the file and uploaded it to the Galactic Communications Grid. Within hours, Danny's words had traveled farther than any trade ship. His question echoed across the network, repeated in translation after translation, language after language, species after species. If the Velhari are truly lesser beings, then why does the Dominion need chains to keep them still? It was not a complicated question. That was what made it so dangerous. It did not come with legal arguments or political demands. It was just a question, spoken plainly by a man from a species that most of the galaxy did not take seriously. And it landed like a stone thrown into still water. The first ripples came from the smaller species in the Accord, the ones who had kept quiet for decades because the Dracon were too powerful to challenge. The Sethori, a species of engineers who had been denied full Accord membership for years, released a public statement calling for a review of the Dominion's labor laws. The Olani, a peaceful trading people who had long avoided politics, sent a formal inquiry to the Accord Council asking how the labor allocation program was classified under sentient rights provisions. One by one, voices that had been silent began to speak. But the biggest response came from the Valhari themselves. Across dozens of stations and colonies where Valhari workers served in silence, something extraordinary began. They stopped working. Not with violence, not with noise, not with demands. They simply stood still. They put down their tools and their trays and their brooms, and they stood with their hands open at their sides, palms facing outward. It was a traditional Valhari gesture, old and almost forgotten, a gesture of remembrance for things lost and things hoped for. Thousands of Valhari workers, standing in silence, palms open, across every corner of Dracon space. The Dominion had no protocol for this. Their systems were built to handle rebellion, resistance, violence. They had weapons and restraints and holding cells for all of those things. But they had no tool for silence. They had no answer for a people who simply stopped and stood still and refused to disappear. On the Starling Drift, Nate Greer was not sitting idle. He had gathered the crew in the common room and told them everything. He did not give a speech. He just told them what Danny had done and what had happened to Sara. And then he asked them a simple question. Do we leave without her? The answer was unanimous. They did not. Nate sent a message to the 3 other human vessels docked in the sector, merchant ships and a small research vessel. He told them the situation. He didn't ask for anything. He just told them. Within an hour, all 3 ships had signaled quietly that they were delaying their departures. No explanations, no official statements. They simply stayed. Penny Walsh, meanwhile, had taken a different approach. She compiled her full medical report on Sara, every scan, every healed fracture, every sign of neglect and harm, and submitted it to the Accord's Independent Medical Ethics Board. It was a long shot. The Ethics Board had no enforcement power over the Dominion. But the report existed now, in the official record, where it could not be erased. Cor Dracon was beginning to feel something unfamiliar. He stood in his office, watching the reports come in from across the station and beyond, and he felt the ground shifting beneath him. The Valhari silence was spreading. The minor species were asking questions that no one had asked before. And at the center of it all was one human, one unremarkable officer from an unremarkable species, who had simply refused to look away. Cor did not understand it. He had studied humanity during their provisional entry to the Accord. Their military was average. Their technology was behind. Their economy was developing, but not impressive. There was nothing about them that should have mattered. But he had missed something. He had looked at the numbers and the weapons and the ships, and he had not seen the thing that made humans dangerous. It was not strength or intelligence or resources. It was something far more difficult to quantify. It was the stubborn, irrational, deeply human refusal to accept that suffering was someone else's problem. Cor made a decision. He contacted Danny's quarters directly and had the communication channel reopened. Danny's face appeared on the screen, tired and unshaven, but steady. "I will offer you a compromise," Cor said. "The Valhari female will be returned to your custody. Your ship will be permitted to remain. The trade agreement will proceed as planned." Danny waited. "In exchange," Cor continued, "you will issue a public statement retracting your comments at the tribunal. You will affirm that the Dominion's labor practices are lawful under the Accord Charter, and you will acknowledge that your behavior was a cultural misunderstanding." Danny looked at him through the screen. He thought about the trade deal. He thought about Earth's seat on the Accord Council. He thought about everything Chris Langley had told him. All the logical reasons to say yes, to smooth things over, to play the game the way the galaxy expected it to be played. Then he thought about Sara standing with her hands open, and all the Velhari who were standing just like her across the stars, and he shook his head. "No," Danny said. Kor's jaw tightened. "You understand what you are refusing? Everything your species has worked for in this sector is at risk." "I understand," Danny said. "But I'm not going to stand in front of a camera and tell the galaxy that what you're doing is okay. Because it's not." The channel went dead. For 2 days, nothing happened. Danny waited. The crew waited. The Velhari stood in silence. The galaxy held its breath. Then Chris Langley did something no one, least of all Chris himself, expected. He had spent the entire week urging caution, calculating risks, measuring every word and every action against the fragile politics of humanity's place in the Accord. He was a diplomat. It was his job to keep things stable, to avoid conflict, to find the middle ground where everyone could stand without falling. But there was no middle ground here. He had read Penny's medical report. He had seen the recording of the hearing. He had watched the Velhari stand in silence across every screen on the station. And somewhere in the space between his professional training and his own conscience, something had quietly broken. Chris sat down at his desk, opened a secure channel to the Galactic Accord's Central Council, and drafted a formal request. It was written in the careful, precise language of interstellar diplomacy, but its meaning was unmistakable. He was requesting an independent review of the Dracon Dominion's labor practices, the first such request in the entire history of the Accord. Before he sent it, he walked to Danny's quarters. The guard at the door let him in without argument. Chris stood in the small room and looked at Danny, who was sitting at the table with an empty plate in front of him. "I'm sending the request," Chris said. Danny looked up. "An independent review," Chris continued. "Full scope. The Dominion's labor system, the Velhari program, all of it. It won't change things overnight. It might not change things at all. But it puts the question on the record. And once it's on the record, they can't pretend it doesn't exist." Danny stood up slowly. "What about the trade deal?" Chris smiled, just barely. "Some deals aren't worth making, Danny." He turned and walked out. 10 minutes later, the request was transmitted. The signal crossed the vast distances of space at the speed of light, carrying with it a simple truth that the Dracon had tried very hard to keep quiet. Someone had finally asked the question, and now the whole galaxy was listening. The Galactic Accord's special session convened 11 days after Chris Langley's request was transmitted. It was the fastest the Council had ever moved on anything, and everyone in the galaxy knew why. The silence of the Velhari had not stopped. If anything, it had grown. What had begun as a few thousand workers standing still on a handful of stations had spread to every corner of Dracon-controlled space. Entire supply lines had slowed. Factories ran at half capacity. Stations that depended on Velhari labor struggled to maintain basic operations. And still, the Velhari said nothing. They simply stood, hands open, palms outward, and waited. The Dracon Dominion arrived at the council session with their usual confidence, but even they could feel the shift. For centuries, no one had questioned their authority. Their military was vast, their economy was entangled with half the galaxy, and their seat on the council was one of the oldest and most powerful. They had always operated under the assumption that strength was the only currency that mattered. They had not prepared for a species that believed kindness was a form of strength. The session lasted 3 days. Representatives from dozens of species spoke. The Sithori presented engineering data showing how Velhari labor had been systematically undervalued and exploited. The Olani shared trade records, revealing that the Dominion had profited enormously from what they called hospitality, while paying nothing to the workers who made it possible. A Velhari elder, one of the few who had been permitted to leave Dracon space, stood before the council and spoke in a voice that trembled but did not break. She told them about the libraries that had been burned. She told them about children taken from their families and trained to kneel before they could walk. She told them about the 2 moons that an entire generation had never seen. The Accord Council approved an independent oversight committee to review and reform the Dominion's labor practices. It was not abolition. The Dracon had too much political weight for that. But it was the first formal recognition that the system was wrong. The first crack in a wall that had stood for longer than most species could remember. The Dracon accepted the ruling with stiff, silent fury. They had no choice. Refusing would have meant isolation from the Accord, and even the Dominion could not survive that. Cor Dracon stood in the council chamber with his hands clasped behind his back, and his face carved from stone. He did not speak to anyone as he left. On Threshold Station, the holding wing where Sara had been kept, was quiet. A single guard stood at the door, scrolling through a report on his datapad. He received an order, read it twice, and then opened the cell. She was thinner than before, and there were shadows under her dark eyes that had not been there a week ago. But she stood straight, and when she walked, her steps were steady. Danny was waiting in the corridor. He had been released from confinement that morning, after the Accord's ruling had been announced. Nate had come to get him, grinning from ear to ear, talking a mile a minute about everything that had happened while Danny had been locked away. Danny had listened, nodded, and then asked one question. Where is she? Now he stood in the gray corridor outside the holding wing, with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking like the same ordinary man he had always been. No uniform decorations, no title of importance, no grand presence. Just Danny Cole, from a small town on a small planet, waiting for someone he cared about. Sara saw him, and stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. The corridor was silent, except for the low hum of the station's life support systems. "Have you eaten?" Danny asked. Sara laughed. It was sudden and real and unexpected. A sound that came from somewhere deep inside her that she had kept locked away for so long that she had almost forgotten it existed. It echoed off the metal walls and filled the corridor, and Danny thought it was the best sound he had ever heard. "No," she said, still smiling. "I have not eaten." "Come on, then," he said. "I'll make something." They walked back to the Starling Drift together. Nate and Penny were waiting at the airlock. Penny hugged Sara without asking, and Sara, after a moment of surprise, hugged her back. Nate stood to the side with his arms folded, trying to look casual, but his eyes were bright and his smile was wide. In the days that followed, the galaxy continued to move. The Oversight Committee began its work, sending inspectors to Dracon stations and colonies. Reform was slow and difficult, and there were setbacks and resistance at every step. But the process had started, and once it started, it could not be undone. Sara did not return to service. Under the new provisions, Velhari workers were given the right to request reassignment or release, and she was among the first to file. She was free to go where she wanted, and what she wanted surprised everyone except Danny. She wanted to speak. The Accord Council, as part of its reform process, invited Velhari representatives to address the council for the first time in history. Sara was not a politician or a diplomat. She had no training in public speaking, and no experience with the complex rituals of interstellar governance. But she had something that no amount of training could provide. She had lived it. She stood before the council in a simple gray dress, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her healed wrist steady at her side. The chamber was vast, filled with representatives from dozens of species, hundreds of eyes watching, thousands more following the broadcast across the galaxy. She spoke in her own language first, a few lines of Velhari that most of the council could not understand. Then she switched to the common trade language and told her story. She spoke about the day she was taken from her home world, about the years of silence and service, about the broken wrist that no one had treated, and the name that no one had asked. She spoke about compliance inspections and the sound of a door opening without a chime. She spoke clearly and without anger, because anger was not what she felt. What she felt was something much older and much stronger. When a council member asked her what had changed, what had made her believe that things could be different, she paused. She looked out across the chamber, and somewhere in the upper gallery she found a familiar face. Danny was sitting between Nate and Penny, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, watching her with the same quiet attention he had given her on the first night in that small room on Threshold Station. "Someone set a place for me at his table," Sara said. "He made me a meal and asked me my name. And it reminded me of something I had forgotten. It reminded me that I was a person." The chamber was silent for a long time after that. Up in the gallery, Nate elbowed Danny in the ribs. "You look like a proud older brother," he whispered. Danny just smiled. 3 days later, the Starling Drift undocked from Threshold Station for the last time. The trade deal had never been signed. By every economic measure, the mission had been a failure. The cargo holds were empty. The contracts were unsigned. The accounts showed nothing gained. Danny stood at the viewport and watched the station shrink behind them, its lights growing smaller and smaller, until they were just another set of stars in the dark. Penny came up beside him. "The council is already talking about expanding the oversight program," she said. "2 more species have filed reform petitions, and there's a proposal to create a permanent Velhari Cultural Preservation Fund." Danny nodded. He didn't say anything. "You did a good thing, Danny," she said softly. "I just made dinner," he said. Penny shook her head and walked away, smiling to herself. Later that evening, when the ship was running quiet on its course toward home, the communications console beeped. Nate checked it and called Danny over. "Short-range transmission," Nate said. "Velhari frequency." Danny sat down and opened the message. It was a text file, written in the Velhari script, with a translation attached. It was a poem, old and beautiful, one of the pieces that had been lost when the Dominion burned the libraries. Sara had remembered it. She had carried it in her mind for all those years, through all those stations and all those gray rooms, and she had kept it alive the only way she could, by never forgetting it. She had sent it to Danny because she wanted him to have it. He read the translation slowly. The poem was about the 2 moons of her home world, about the way they rose together and turned the sky into something that looked like it was glowing from the inside. It was about distance and light and the spaces between things. The last line read, "The ones who kneel beside us are greater than the ones who stand above us." Danny read it twice. Then he saved the message, closed the terminal, and sat for a moment in the quiet hum of the ship. Through the viewport, the stars stretched out in every direction, endless and bright. He stood up, pushed in his chair, and went back to work. There was nothing else to do. There was nothing else he needed. He was just a man on a ship, heading home, carrying a poem he would keep for the rest of his life. And somewhere far behind him, on a station full of red and black banners, a woman with pale blue skin and dark, steady eyes was standing before a room full of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. And she was no longer kneeling.